Have you ever stopped to think about the words you use every day? We tend to think we're in charge of our language, but honestly, it's surprising how often it's actually in charge of us. Today, we're going to dive into some of those hidden traps. So here's the question for you. When you say something, are you 100% sure what your words really mean? I'm not just talking about the dictionary definition, but their history, their baggage, all the ways they can be twisted and misunderstood. Let's start with a really simple everyday word.
Okay, take the word nice. We all use it, right? It means someone is pleasant or kind. But if you trace it all the way back, its Latin root, nescius, actually meant ignorant. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never called someone nice and secretly meant they were ignorant. It's a perfect example of just how dramatically a word's meaning can flip over time.
And that's really the heart of it. Words aren't these static fossils, with one true meaning locked in forever. Nope. They're living, breathing things that change and evolve. And if we don't get that, we fall into some pretty major traps. So today, we're going to uncover 3 of the most common and honestly, most powerful word traps out there.
First up is a mistake that is way more common than you'd think. It's called the root fallacy. And believe me, it's a source of some really stubborn myths about language.
So the root fallacy is this idea that to find a word's real meaning, you have to dig all the way to its original root. It's kind of like insisting that a butterfly must literally be made of butter. I mean, that's just silly, right? But we do this all the time with more complicated ideas, and we don't even realize it.
And what's wild is how obvious this becomes when you look at modern examples. When you say goodbye, you're not thinking about God, are you? Of course not. And as the linguist J.P. Liu points out, everybody knows a pineapple isn't some weird apple that grows on a pine tree. Our language is just full of these little ghosts of old meanings that don't define how we use words now. Exactly. And as the scholar D.A. Carson puts it, we just instinctively get this in our everyday conversations. When we call someone nice, we mean nice. Period. The current use is what matters, not some ancient root that nobody remembers.
But let's get a little more serious, because this fallacy can have some pretty big consequences. Take the Greek word monogenesy. It's a really key term in theology, and for centuries, it's been translated as only begotten. That translation comes directly from this trap, the root fallacy.
Okay, so here's the trap. People assumed the root gen came from the verb geneo, which means to beget. But it could also come from the noun genos, which means kind or class. If that's the case, the word doesn't mean only begotten at all. It means one of a kind or unique. And honestly, modern linguists and how the word was actually used back then strongly suggests unique is the better fit. That is a huge difference in meaning, all hanging on a wrong assumption about a word's root.
All right, let's move on to our second trap. This one involves a little bit of mental time travel, and you'd be surprised how often people do it. I call it reading time backwards.
The fancy term for this is semantic anachronism. It's what happens when we grab a word's modern meaning and just sort of inject it back into an ancient text. We assume that the author, writing thousands of years ago, meant what we mean by that word today. It's basically like arguing that Shakespeare must have been writing about computers because he used the word Windows.
Oh man, I've heard this one so many times. Someone's reading the Bible, they get to Romans 1:16, and they see the Greek word for power is dunamis. And then the light bulb goes off. Dunamis. That sounds like dynamite. So the gospel is the dynamite of God. It sounds so cool and powerful, right? But yeah, it's a classic anachronism.
Just look at the timeline here. The Apostle Paul wrote about dunamis in the 1st century. Alfred Nobel didn't even invent dynamite until 1867. We're talking about an 1800-year gap. There is absolutely, positively no way Paul was thinking about dynamite.
And what's even more important is that the two concepts are polar opposites. As Carson points out, the dunamis of God in the New Testament is a creative power. It's the power that saves, that makes things whole, the power that raised Jesus from the dead. Dynamite? It's a destructive force that blows things up. So the analogy doesn't just get the timing wrong, it completely misses the entire point of the text.
So that brings us to our third and final trap for today, which is basically the mirror image of the last one. This is what happens when we try to use a meaning for a word that, well, has been dead for a very long time.
This one is called semantic obsolescence. It's the mistake of digging up some old ghost meaning, a definition a word had centuries ago, and trying to apply it today even though that meaning is no longer valid. You're basically assigning a word a meaning that is already dead and buried. Let's trace the life of the word martus, which is the Greek word that gave us our English word martyr. It started out super simple. It just meant a witness, like someone in a courtroom. But over time, it started to shift. It became someone who witnesses to their faith. Then it became someone who witnesses even when they're threatened with death. And finally, it landed on the main meaning we know today, someone who dies for their faith or a cause. It would be a huge mistake to read that final meaning of death back into every single ancient text that uses the word martus.
Okay, so we've covered root fallacies, semantic anachronisms, and semantic obsolescence. And you might be sitting there thinking, this is kind of interesting, but why does this really matter to me? I'm not translating ancient Greek manuscripts for a living.
Well, it matters a whole lot, trust me. Understanding these traps isn't just some dusty academic exercise. It's a fundamental skill for thinking clearly, especially in the world we live in today.
Seriously, being aware of these traps is like having a superpower. You start to see how words are constantly being used to spin things and persuade you. You'll spot political spin that relies on some obscure old definition. You'll analyze news headlines differently when they play on a word's double meaning. You'll even understand legal contracts better, where the precise definition of one word can change everything. It just makes you a sharper thinker and a way clearer communicator.
At the end of the day, it really comes down to this quote from D.A. Carson. Critical thinking isn't about being cynical or negative. It's about having solid reasons, justification for what you believe and say. So the next time someone tries to win an argument by saying, well, the real meaning of this word is, you'll be able to see if they're actually using a fact or just falling for a fallacy.
So, the bottom line is this. This knowledge helps you move beyond just passively hearing words. It gives you the tools to actively analyze them, to question the assumptions behind them, and to get much, much closer to the meaning that was actually intended, whether you're reading an ancient text or just scrolling through today's newsfeed.
And that leaves us with one last thing to chew on. What common ideas, what truths that you take for granted might actually be built on one of these word traps? Really think about it. The answer might just surprise you.